And I'm going to put everyone on mute except for John.
Great.
Okay, I'm going to start it now. Thank you.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and good morning to many of us around the world. My name is John Carey, and it's my honor to be moderating this special webinar for the Bernard Van Leer Foundation. This is the session of Early Childhood Matters, which is a journal of the Foundation about early childhood. It specifically looks at the development of young children from a psychological perspective, and it's published twice a year by the Foundation. This upcoming issue is focused on small children in big cities, and in conjunction with that, as well as a major conference that took place in New Delhi late last month, we've invited 3 panelists to join us. They were also contributors to the journal. Each of them will have the opportunity to make about 10 minutes of remarks that you all who are tuning in online or via phone will be able to hear. There are some slides if you're able to not just be on the phone but also see it online. There are 3 extraordinary people from very different backgrounds and disciplines. The first of them that will speak is Gary Evans, and Gary is many things, but he's specifically a professor in the College of Human Ecology at Cornell University, and he looks at issues pertinent to childhood development in cities, ranging from pollution to overcrowding to chronic noise exposure, and many other things in between. And I'm very interested in Gary because he made a note of something in his particular essay called Learn Helplessness that I think is a major hurdle that a lot of people in a lot of settings have to overcome, and Gary seems to know a bit more than most of us about that. So with that, and before I introduce the other 2 panelists, why don't we go ahead and just jump right in with Gary. So Gary, if you'd like to take it away.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'd like to talk about a phenomenon called cumulative risk. And if you look at the next slide, you'll see that we can talk about risks both from the physical and the social environment. And one of the points that's important is when we talk about risk or we talk about stress and child development, we need to remember that the environment is both psychosocial and physical. The second point that I'm going to make this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, is that the confluence of risk or the accumulation of multiple risk exposures has a much greater impact than singular risk exposure. And then the last point that I want to emphasize is that childhood poverty is related in a strong fashion to elevated cumulative risk exposure. So in the next slide, I have a list of different kinds of risk factors that we might want to consider. So we can start with some physical factors. Some of these include things like toxins. An example would be lead. Noise. Usually this is from transportation sources. Crowding. By crowding, a particular important point is that people per room is the critical variable. Housing, we're referring to housing quality as well as the kind of housing. For example, high-rises versus single-family dwellings. Daycare and school facilities, just to remind us that these are physical environments as well as organizational, psychosocial settings. Another characteristic of the physical environment that's important is neighborhood deterioration. Of course, ambient pollutants, photochemical oxidants, sulfur dioxide, sulfur emissions, and then a construct of chaos, which really is talking about a lot of stimulation, but also calling attention to what we call stochastic properties. What we mean by this is predictability and regularity, or the lack thereof. Next slide, I have a list of what are some salient psychosocial exposures. These include insecure attachment, that sort of primary bond that children need to have between themselves and one primary caregiver. This usually occurs during the second year of life, beginning of the first year and on into the second. Another source of risk for many children is conflict and turmoil. Of course, exposure to violence, insensitive parenting. What this means is a lack of responsiveness. This could be to emotional needs or instrumental needs of the child. And then a lack of control or feelings of helplessness, not having a sense of mastery. So if we take a look at the next slide, I want to talk about cumulative risk. Next slide, please. One of the things that's important to understand, first of all, is that many of these risks do not occur in isolation. So take, for example, family turmoil and crowding. How might those two be interrelated? They might seem like very different things. But if you stop and think about it for a second, if you have insufficient ability to regulate social interaction in your primary environment, if it's difficult to be alone when you want to, if it's difficult to be in a dyad, or if you have a small group, one of the things that may create is a coping mechanism of withdrawing. So if I have too much on social interaction, I may withdraw. One of the things that withdrawal can do is lead to less responsiveness, and if it's frustrating or difficult to do what I want to do, it may also lead to conflict and turmoil. And as you can see on this graph, as the number of risk factors goes up on the x-axis from the left to the right, various important outcomes in children, like psychological adjustment, a sense of competency, academic performance, drop off. So the next slide shows a similar function, but instead of looking at behavioral outcomes, this slide is looking at chronic physiological stress. And as you can see, the results are not as strong as in the prior graph. But again, as you go from left to right, increasing cumulative risk exposure, you see evidence that the amount of chronic physiological stress in children, this particular slide is of 8 and 9-year-old, increases. So it's important to understand that although one risk factor may be problematic, when these start to layer on top of each other, the impacts are much greater, much more severe. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons poverty may be such a difficult problem and in some ways not intractable, but extremely challenging problem for families and organizations and society to deal with is because of this overlap between poverty and cumulative risk exposure. So in the next slide, one of the things we see is the relationship between poverty and individual physical and psychosocial risk factors. This is from a study of 8 and 9-year-old children. These children are all Caucasian, Euro-American background, in rural areas in the United States. And what you can see in this slide, for example, is people per room density is much higher in the poor versus middle-income families, noise in the home, housing problems. In each case, as you can see from the graph, much higher exposure to these risk factors. Then in the next graph, you can see a parallel thing for family turmoil, children being separated from their family for any extended period of time, and exposure to violence. So for a set of 3 physical risk factors, density, noise, housing problems, and 3 psychosocial risk factors, family turmoil, child separation from family, and exposure to violence. The low-income children or the poverty children, again, remember these are 8 and 9-year-olds, are exposed to much higher levels. But what the next slide shows is even more interesting and I think more important. So next slide, please. Here what you see is that same study of the 8 and 9-year-olds, but instead of exposure to each individual risk factor, now you see exposure to the accumulation of these 6 risk factors: crowding, noise, housing quality, family turmoil, child separation from family, and exposure to violence. And as you can see on the left side, where there's 0 cumulative risk, essentially no poor children have none. And then as you move to the right, almost no middle-income children have high levels of cumulative risk exposure. So if you think back to those 2 slides where I showed you this relationship between cumulative risk exposure and important childhood outcomes like psychological adjustment, chronic physiological stress, cognitive development, you can put these 2 facts together and raise the question or raise the issue that maybe one of the reasons childhood poverty is such a problematic thing for children's development and their families is because of this exposure to cumulative risk. So again, a takeaway message here is that one of the reasons, not the only reason, that poverty may be difficult for children and families is because of this exposure to the influence of risk factors. So I think, thank you very much, and we'll move on to the next talk now.
Thank you so much, Gary. That was a fascinating presentation. I was particularly taken with some of those very early salient risks that you talked about, both physical and psychosocial. We are aware that Gary had an echo, and it means that every webinar attendee pretty much heard everything that he said twice. So on a positive note, I think that makes us all twice as smart as we expected to be. So I just wanted to especially thank Gary for that super insightful presentation. Another kind of housekeeping note for the webinar.
Hello? Okay, we move on to the next presenter, and that's Leah Karsten.
Shall I start?
Yes, please.
Yes? Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Here is Leah Karsten from Europe, from Amsterdam, and my presentation is about the construction of new urban childhoods and the changing relationship between cities and children. Within the context of Western European cities, we have long considered cities and children to be 2 mutual excluding concepts, as is illustrated in this table. Cities are associated with the public domain of paid work and politics, while children are related with the private domain of the family, the single-family home and green environments. This dichotomous conceptualization of cities and children defines city children as out of place. Yet, children and families have always lived in cities. It's only since the massive suburbanization process in the 20th century that urban family living is considered to be problematic. Family households became a minority in large cities, although never completely. Outward middle-class family suburbanization went along with the immigration of lower-class households in the European context, mostly poor immigrant families from less economically advanced countries. On top of this, we see a new trend of middle-class families opting again for the city as a place to live. And both developments are reflected in the numbers. Children are increasingly likely to live in cities. Here, next slide please, you see the figures of Amsterdam. Next slide please. Until recently, declining numbers, but from 2000 onwards we see a growth of children population. And Amsterdam is not unique. Urban family life is growing in several European cities, from Paris to Berlin to Helsinki and London, and include also some areas in New York, as is illustrated with this picture of Brooklyn Bridge Park. Next slide, please. This picture I made on a sunny Sunday afternoon, and you see that it's really full of young families in New York, in Brooklyn and Manhattan. This family reclaiming the city goes along with changing patterns of children's activities. And today I will briefly focus on two: the decline of playing outdoors and the rise of children's consumption spaces. First, playing outdoors. Next slide, please. While the number of city children is on the increase, studies worldwide demonstrate the loss of significance of the city street as a site for growing up. Jill Valentine argues that urban public space is transforming into adult space. Over the years, children's outdoor play has reduced and has increasingly become supervised. Historical research in the Netherlands revealed that before the 1970s, playing outdoors was a matter of course for all children of all classes. Within the pillarized Dutch society of that time, these children gathering on the street had a particular strength. Children with different backgrounds met each other regularly and without much interference by adults, as is illustrated by this quote of a woman raised in Amsterdam in the 1960s. Next slide, please. I joined a steady group of children who all lived in our street or one of the streets nearby. When we came out of school, out of different schools, we used to meet on a small square nearby and play together. Catholic, Protestant, and also communist children. It didn't matter to us. The indoor child, or while the unsupervised outdoor child has become marginalized, two new types of child have emerged. Can you go one slide back, please, again? The indoor children and vaccine generation. The indoor child is probably worst off. They play outdoors only rarely, are not allowed to explore their neighborhood and to learn from urban experiences. And they don't build a social capital related to meetings with friends in the street. The children of the vaccine generation, with their fully booked agenda, have quite different lives. They are always closely supervised, as is illustrated with those pictures from Hong Kong and Amsterdam. A very ordinary picture in Hong Kong is that children are brought to school by their helper in taxis, which is, I think, very strange actually. Their learning experiences and social capital are related to the numerous consumption spaces they visit. That brings me to the rise of urban consumption spaces. Next slide, please. The next one, yes. With the decrease of children playing outdoors, new patterns of spending after school time have emerged. Raising children is aimed at the acquirement of a broad range of skills and experiences. According to Larau, it's particularly middle-class parents who are engaged in a project of concerted cultivation. This new approach of raising children is further supported by today's commercialized childhood infrastructure as I have described for both the Amsterdam and Hong Kong situation. Large cities are increasingly characterized by new children's and family consumption infrastructure consisting of family welcoming services, childcare facilities, and children's leisure spaces. Here you see a restaurant on the right-hand side, a picture of a restaurant who's especially focusing on young families having dinner outside. This new market-driven infrastructure now fosters a new urban family culture, although not for all families to the same extent. But as Holloway and Pindler argue, the discourse of children educating in a wide range of skills is very widespread, also among lower-class families. Definitions of good childhood are changing. The new children and family spaces seems to fit today's city children well. That brings me to some concluding remarks about urban childhood today in both negative and positive terms. Next slide, please. First, the negative side. It's evidently clear that a decrease of outdoor play is a loss for children, including the ones who still play outdoors regularly. Today's urban design towards ever-rising densities is not always very supportive, to say the least. Here you see a sign in a new apartment complex in Amsterdam with the highest density of the Netherlands. It says, "This court is not for children's play." This is the first time I came across such a sign in the Netherlands, and I think it's a very negative experience and a very unique one till now in Amsterdam actually. This neglect of children's needs to play outdoors contributes to the construction of isolated, segregated, unequal and commercialized urban childhoods. Second, and to end with some positive words, next slide please. The growing number of urban families and children reflect the development towards a more family-inclusive city, away from the dichotomously conceptualized city of the past. Central urban areas are transforming in places to raise children, and from this perspective, children are not only losing agency, they are also important agents of societal change. I want to argue that we cannot continue with only emphasizing what has been lost in our cities. We have to shift the discussion to an exploration of what has replaced past practices. Children have developed a much broader activity patterns than they used to have, with lots of new learning experiences, and those activities seem to flourish in urban contexts. One might even ask, are we replacing the former rural ideal, and developing towards a new urban ideal for children? In that case, there is a big challenge left. How can we contribute to an inclusive city, or how to facilitate today's children's changing activity patterns in a way that children of different classes and backgrounds profit from a stimulating urban environment, as for example this one in the Amsterdam Ooster Park. This is my favorite picture actually, because you see children playing around with all different backgrounds, and it seems to be a very nice and attractive activity for both children and parents. Well, I must say that within this short context of this short presentation, I have to excuse for my very superficial indicating of urban trends. But in case you want to read more about these new trends, I can show you my email address in the next slide. And you can also go to my website where you can download my publications. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. It sounds like people can hear me again. I apologize for somehow dropping off midway through my remarks and introduction of Leah. One other important thing, aside from the beautiful introduction that I had crafted for Leah, was that I wanted to point out that in the control panel in the webinar software, every attendee should be able to find a comment box or a message box, and you can type in questions that will be seen by Andrew Wright as well as Teresa Marino, who are involved extensively, of course, with the editing of Early Childhood Matters. And so I just want to again thank Leah. That was super enlightening. I found so many, as a new parent I should say, I found so many of the things that you had to say incredibly interesting. I love the idea as children as important agents of social change, and I love this notion of a new urban ideal for children, and that even if there are these new norms, that there are positive aspects of some of these norms that that you so thoughtfully focus on. So thank you, Leah, for that. So our third and final panelist today is Marika Shiori-Clark. And Marika is a longtime friend. We worked together several years ago. She is, like many of our other panelists, or each of our other panelists, she is many things. She's presented here as a global fellow of IDEO.org, which is a nonprofit organization based in San Francisco working around the world to eradicate poverty. And she just does some really fascinating work. So with that, I wanted to offer Marika the stage to talk about a human-centered design approach to parenting and poverty.
Thanks, John. So yeah, as John said, I'm going to first talk a little bit about human-centered design, explain what that is, and then just go a little bit into a project that I worked on when I was at IDEO.org as a way to illustrate that. So next slide. As John mentioned, I worked a lot at a firm called IDEO.org, and IDEO.org, the nonprofit arm of a larger design firm called IDEO, has sort of pioneered this methodology called human-centered design. And the idea behind it really is that you're trying to kind of use a designer's mindset to uncover sort of insights about people's behavior and their experiences at the beginning of a project. And then the idea that that can lead you into learning about things in their lives, and that will help you to come up with ideas for the project that you're working on. So the idea of really understanding people's behavior and their personal experiences. So just by way of example, this is an example of a project that IDEO did where they worked with a large hospital chain and were tasked with the goal of improving the patient experience in the hospital. And so one of the members of the design team pretended that he had a broken leg and brought a video camera into the ER and videotaped his entire experience as a patient in the hospital to understand kind of what is it actually like to be a patient in this hospital. And on the right-hand side, you can see the sort of blank ceilings, which were the main thing that he saw the entire time. And so then that led the design team into really thinking about, if we're improving the patient experience, let's think about improving actually the ceilings and these other surfaces in the hospital that are usually not very considered in the process. Next slide. And so another project that IDEO worked on was with Bank of America, and this one was really around thinking about new programs that would encourage people to save. And so the team did a lot of work talking with a lot of different people, and especially a lot of women who at that time were still writing a lot of checks, and especially to utility companies. And they found this interesting behavior that a lot of people were rounding up their bills to the next round number, or so in this case, so 2740, they actually just sent a bill for $30, and then that extra little amount would get just added on to their bill as kind of a positive amount for the next bill. And they thought this was a really interesting behavior and asked about it, and people said, well, you know, it's easier for me to keep track of my finances if I'm just doing things in round numbers. So that was sort of an interesting insight that they found, and they decided to use that to create what's now called Keep the Change, which is a saving program where if you buy something at a store, you can opt into this program to round up each purchase to the next whole number, and that the extra change automatically it's put in a savings account for you. And it's been super popular, and they actually I think had something like 5 million people or something in the first year sign up for this because people were so excited about this program. So the idea that you're really first understanding, and sometimes it's even little quirks or unexpected observations in people's behavior, and using that as a way to get to new ideas. Next slide. So again, this is the idea of the human-centered design process, that if you see the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at the beginning of the process you're really taking a lot of time just to observe people and get a sense of their stories. What are their experiences? What are the frustrations they have with whatever your topic is? What are the things they get excited about? What are the things they're scared about? And really getting a sense of people's lives. And then synthesizing some of those observations into a set of insights. And those insights usually end up being sort of, what are some of the problems or the barriers people face? And then you can flip those into this idea of an opportunity. So how do you take a problem and think about, well, what could we do that would actually address some of these stories and these barriers people are facing? Oh, sorry, go to the next slide. So again, here, so the here stage bracketed would be kind of the beginning part where you're observing people's experiences and stories. Next slide. And then kind of synthesizing some of those stories and experiences into these opportunities. And then next slide, you're getting to prototyping as quickly as possible. So that's sort of another aspect of this, is that you get this set of insights and opportunities and then come up with ideas quickly and then test them out. And the idea is that your initial ideas probably won't be right, but the quicker you test them out, the quicker you will understand what the issues are and be able to tweak them. So the idea is that instead of spending a lot of time getting to the perfect answer, try things out before they're perfect to understand what you can change. Next slide. So I did a project for a foundation called the Bezos Foundation, which focuses a lot on early learning and early childhood education. And they tasked us with trying to understand parenting and poverty in the United States. So with working with low-income parents in the United States and thinking about kind of a media campaign that could encourage parents to sort of engage more with their children, whatever that meant. So we spent about 5 weeks interviewing and spending a great deal of time with low-income parents in different parts of the United States. Next slide. And what we found from these interviews was that a lot of the messaging around parenting was really aimed at very average contexts and average parents, and predominantly a middle-class white audience, at least in the United States. So if you look at parenting magazines, a lot of the articles written about parenting, it's very much focused towards a specific segment of the population. Next slide. And it was sort of a context that a lot of the parents that we talked to felt was not relevant to their lives. So, for instance, we talked to a lot of doctors, and the standard message we found that most people said was that to be a good parent, you should read an hour a day to your children. And in the case of most of the parents that we worked with, they weren't fully literate. And so the idea of saying read an hour a day to your children is sort of an irrelevant comment. It doesn't make sense, and it's not something that these parents are going to be able to do. They also are often working 2 or 3 jobs. They don't have an hour to sit down just to read to their children. They're juggling between a lot of different things. And so we found that the constraints facing low-income parents, as it says, are far from average, and there is really not a great deal of messaging in the United States that's targeting low-income parents and giving advice that feels relevant to their lives. Next slide. And so one mother that we talked to said, the public assistance teacher was 23, white, and straight out of school. Who are you to tell me how to raise my kids? So there's really this sense of like a lot of judgment around, are you a good parent if you're reading an hour a day to your kid, or are you not a good parent? And so, next slide. Our campaign really focused around how do you create a message that that really works with the realities of a low-income parent's lives. One thing we found is that actually you don't need to read an hour a day to your children to make sure that their brains grow. And some experts that we talked to said that a book is just a prop for engagement. So you really don't need to be reading at all. It doesn't matter with a young child if you're reading or if you're just talking to them or singing or dancing. It's really more just about the engagement. And so some of the things that we came up with were small little kind of guerrilla acts, like putting things on a milk carton saying, talk about the sounds farm animals make. So small activities that a parent can do easily with their children in that moment. So instead of having to sit down for an hour, what can you do in the 5 minutes when you're trying to get them ready for school and off? Next slide. Or similarly, when you're in the grocery store, point to all the round foods. So again, just very simple activities that can be done within the kind of existing activities of a very busy low-income parent's life. Next slide. One space that we found was a big area for opportunity was at the laundromat. So a lot of parents take their children with them to the laundromat. They're there, everyone's bored, it's annoying, it takes way too long. So how can you turn that into an area for opportunity? And, thinking about finding all the fuzzy things. Or we had another idea about even putting, small play centers inside urban laundromats as a way to provide, a more engaging activity for the child and the parent. So Bezos has actually launched another version of some of the work that we did as a campaign called Vroom, V-R-O-O-M, that you can look up online. And again, I think the idea behind this is just that by spending a lot of time with low-income parents and taking the time to understand their lives and the barriers that they face and how they might be different than kind of the status quo parenting messaging, yielded a lot of these results and these insights that helped us to come up with ideas that were much more relevant and targeted at their lives specifically. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marika. That was, of course, a super fascinating presentation. If attendees aren't familiar with human-centered design, I really encourage you to learn more about it at IDEO.org or one of the other organizations around the world that practices that methodology. It has relevance across many sectors and has been applied within a range of research by the World Bank, by a whole kind of array of other entities and institutions, and it's a very fascinating thing. And so I don't believe we have any questions submitted yet, and so I'll go ahead and ask one, but we have enabled the question module in the webinar control panel, which I hope every attendee should be able to see now, and you can use that to ask questions, and those will be relayed to me. But in the meantime, you're stuck with some of my questions and observations. So I wanted to draw a line. I heard or felt a line between, or thread between Gary's first presentation during the webinar and Marika's. And specifically, Marika talks about this intense observation, this really deep ethnographic research to understand and really begin to empathize with what users, be they children or parents or others, are experiencing. And Gary was talking about these salient physical risks, these salient psychosocial risks. And it made me curious, Gary, in your research, do you find that parents and other people generally are aware of these risks? You call them salient, but do you find that they're aware of these things, or it's just so much part of their norm that they don't even know what or how to change something?
It's sort of a mixed response. Definitely parents are very aware of particularly some of the risk factors around housing. I think it's a nice example of what Marika was talking about, that the kind of assumptions we make when we talk about better parenting or trying to do things with your children, that usually assumes a platform of housing that's safe, that you don't have to worry about a landlord, putting pressure on you to move, etc. So I think that some of these factors are very salient and very conscious to low-income parents, such as housing. On the other hand, I do think there is evidence that people get used to these things and that they cope with them. I gave the example of crowding and how one of the ways you deal with crowding is you withdraw.
Great. And one other topic that I think I had mentioned in my introductory remarks, but I know that some of my introductory remarks were cut off, was this idea of learned helplessness. So can you talk about how that, for people that aren't familiar with that term, how that is related to knowing that you're exposed to risks, but then not having any ability to change them, or not seeing any of perhaps the government authorities or others be able to change them for you?
You remember on my slide on psychosocial risk factors, the last one I believe was control, or this idea of a sense of mastery. Clearly one of the things that it means to be competent as a human being is to have some awareness and ability to engage and manipulate the environment to suit your own needs or to try to help you get the goals that you're trying to achieve. And one of the things that we know from a lot of research, both qualitative and quantitative, is that when people are chronically exposed to uncontrollable demands, no matter what they do, they can't change the situation. So let me give you an example of that. Think about a school that's located near an airport. So one of the things that's characteristic of that noise is not just the intrusiveness of it, but the fact is that the teachers, the principals, the people living there, and the children, they can't do anything about it. So one of the things that may happen over time is that the children may learn that they have little or no control over certain aspects of their environment. And one of the pernicious aspects of that is that that may generalize to other situations. So, for example, if you give a child who's chronically exposed to noise a puzzle under quiet conditions, I'm not talking about the puzzle during noise, and ask them to work on this puzzle until they can solve it, children who are chronically exposed to noise are much less likely to persist at trying to solve a puzzle. It's not an issue of intelligence or cognitive ability. It's quite literally this child has become accustomed to the fact that when there's something happening in the environment, they may not be able to control it. So they may be less persistent. They may show less motivation.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Gary. I'm curious, Leah, if you wanted to add anything to that. I know that some of your research dovetails and that you have a specific, very interesting approach to looking at the kind of positive aspects of some of these trends. Leah, are you there? Okay. So maybe we'll move on to we have actually a couple of questions that have been submitted through the webinar platform. So thank you for those people that have already done that. One question is more on the housekeeping front. Is this webinar being recorded, and how can I get a copy of it later? Yes, it is being recorded, and we will upload it to YouTube and share the link via bernardvanleer.org. And so there's been, of course, three fantastic presentations, and I hope some more spirited dialogue in the remaining 15 minutes here. Our next question is from Afzal Habib, and it's a question to all the presenters. He first wanted to remark that these were wonderful insights, but he also wanted to point out that they were generally focused on the quote-unquote industrialized world. And so a question for each of the panelists: what work has been done around risk factors or human-centered design in the global South? Anyone want to jump in?
Well, I mean, I can talk. I I don't know that much about work done specifically on risk factors. I can let Gary talk about that. But there's certainly been a lot of work done on early childhood development in the Global South. And I'm actually right now helping IDEO.org with a campaign through a program called Amplify, which is a collaboration between IDEO.org and the UK Department for International Development. And it's all being done on a website called Open IDEO, which you can go to openideo.com. And we have a design challenge running right now, which is sort of a crowdsourced design challenge where people can submit stories and ideas around how to raise a healthy child from 0 to 5. And we've gotten a lot of ideas and stories from people in the Global South in different countries. I was in Tanzania and India a month ago working with people on this challenge to solicit stories and ideas from people, from very low-income people living in rural areas in Tanzania and India. And there's quite a few nonprofit organizations and social enterprises that have submitted ideas through that platform that are working directly in different countries in the Global South. So I think it would be it's a great resource, and it's a great place to be able to learn about different programs that are going on, because there are a lot of really fascinating and innovative approaches that people are using to explore how to help low-income moms and babies, to help their for mothers and fathers to help their children thrive in their first 5 years.
Great, thank you, Marika. And Gary, in terms of risks, are you familiar with any research from the Global South?
One area that's been looked at quite a lot and has actually led to some misunderstandings is crowding. There's a pervasive myth that sort of seems common that people who live in countries like India get used to crowding and it doesn't bother them, that they're sort of somehow more tolerant. And it turns out that there's absolutely no evidence to support that whatsoever. What there is evidence of is when you ask somebody how crowded is a room appear or how crowded do they feel. So if you just rely on their self-report of what they can tell you, there are differences. So you and I might feel more crowded in a room of a certain density than people living in India. However, when you then look at the objective relationship between people per room and outcomes like cortisol, a physiological stress hormone, or if you look at mental health, you see the exact same function. So there is evidence that crowding works very similarly, but I think the big takeaway message about that question, which is a great question by the way, is almost all of what we know about detrimental risk factors in early childhood development comes from North America and Western Europe, which means we've truncated the variance. And what I mean by that in English is that we haven't really looked at the full range of exposure. So, for example, in crowding studies in North America and Europe, one person per room will be among the highest that you're going to find. Well, that's not high at all in India. So what that means is if these variables really are important, we're way underestimating their impacts on children because we mainly studied them in places that are relatively well off. So I think that's another sort of interesting implication about that question. So my own feeling from what I know about crowding anyway is it probably works in very similar ways, but I think we probably really haven't explored the full range of impact because we don't have a chance usually in North America, Europe, and other Australia, for example, to really get that full range of the impact. The same thing with noise levels. If you look at noise levels in a city environment like Amsterdam, where Leah was talking about, and you compare that to Mumbai, I mean, those curves barely even overlap. So a quiet area of Mumbai sounds like a noisy area in Amsterdam.
Gary, thank you so much for that response. I'd love to hear from Leah again, and there's another question that just popped up that I think has relevance to her. And so this is a question from Cynthia Gentry, whose work focuses on play. She said that she'd be interested in panelists' thoughts on the lack of child-led play in the urban environment these days, and also with any comments about or any thoughts on play that is encouraged, at least here in the U.S., to be most worthwhile when nature-based. And so, Leah, could you talk a little bit about like even jumping off the slide that you had where there was this plaza that said children are not allowed to play here. Can you talk a little bit about play? Does that arise in your research?
Yes. I think that one of my conclusions is clear, I think, and that's a conclusion you can see in many parts of the world, that playing outdoors is becoming less common. But at the same time, you see all kinds of developments within, I think, mainly Western European cities. I think there's also a big difference between the US case and Europe. Also, when we are talking about poverty, which is concentrated in cities in the US, while in Europe you see the gentrification of cities, and many cities are becoming better places to live actually. And referring to playing outdoors, what you see in a city like Amsterdam, for example, is that we used to have a lot of playgrounds, and some of them have disappeared. But what we also see is that a new movement within the city directing at creating green, adventurous playgrounds. So what we are doing at the moment in cities like Amsterdam, but you also see it in the other cities I mentioned, that we are integrating green more into the cities, and cities are changing, so they are offering new possibilities for children. And that was my point, that I said that we can't stay with all the time concluding that there is something changed and that we lost this and we lost that, but we see a lot of new developments actually, which can be interpreted as a positive developments and another way of playing outdoors. For example, I've been doing also research in that consumption spaces I mentioned, and I saw that within that consumption spaces, there's a lot of playing actually, but that's not the playing we recognize as the play we used to do ourselves. But there is, of course, for example, the playing within a big store with the steps of the stairs, and children are going onto the stairs and they have fun, etc. So I think the whole character of play has changed, and it's not only it's also within cities we also see the direction towards more green forms of playing. So that may be a difference between Europe and the US, and maybe you recognize something of that.
Great, thank you, Leah. I wanted to also point out that perhaps some of the playgrounds that Leah had mentioned having populated Amsterdam over the past several decades were actually designed by a Dutch architect named Aldo van Eyck, and he's an architect that I've long been fond of and familiar with because I'm an architect by training, and so we invited a woman based in London named Katie Krapow to write an essay for Early Childhood Matters journal. It appears in this current issue that we're here to discuss today, and so she goes in much greater depth than I was familiar with, and I really encourage you all to read that. It's on page 9 of the journal, so I hope that you'll enjoy that. We'll have time for, I think, one more question, and this one comes from Barbara Palisova. She said, "Thank you to all the panelists for the very interesting presentations. I was wondering whether there were any initiatives or projects that Marika was involved with that focused on educating parents on their raising methods and strategies, for example, around parental violence, etc." Marika, would you like to touch on that?
Yeah. So the thing about IDEO.org, I guess, a little bit is that we work with a lot of different clients, and so we'll get hired to work on a project, and we do a lot of research, and we'll, turn things over back to the client, and then, the onus really is usually on them to kind of bring forward the insights that we provided to them. So on that Bezos project, as I mentioned, we kind of encouraged them to pursue this media campaign around everyday activities and things like that, and they actually have kind of launched this campaign more around how to encourage parents to engage and sort of taking a really positive look at kind of how to help parents engage more with their young children. So as far as like initiatives that I'm specifically interested, working on around violence, there are other projects that I've worked on. I've been working a lot with the Nike Foundation, and I've done a lot of work with them in Nigeria, helping them to look at safe spaces for adolescent girls in northern Nigeria, which is an area of the world that that deals with a great deal of violence. And so sort of in development speak, safe spaces doesn't necessarily always mean physical spaces. It can also be programming, creating sort of psychological safe spaces, places where girls can gather and feel safe to, discuss things with each other, learn about things, learn about health-related topics especially. And so, a lot of the work that I've done there has been meeting with girls, understanding the barriers that they face, and then presenting new programs that the Nike Foundation can then pilot in country. And so a lot of the things that I came up with that we've since piloted have been around programming that will be accepted by the community, because that is the only way to introduce a new program in a way that will be safe for girls and that won't be seen as something for some of these terrorist groups to target. So, for instance, one program that we piloted I called Marriage Prep, and the idea is that it's sort of a almost like a club program where girls can get together and learn soft skills, and then also learn like different hard skills. So learn knitting and sewing and things like that, and it's all under the guise of being almost sort of a marriage preparation class, which sounds a little antiquated maybe to this audience, but it's actually, marriage is probably the most important thing for an adolescent girl in Nigeria, and especially for her parents. Their biggest concern is to make sure that she has a good marriage. And so this idea was very kind of well accepted by the community, which is, as I mentioned, kind of one of the most important things, because girls are excited to do anything, but it's really more the community that needs to buy into it in order to accept it and then protect the program and make sure that it will be something that will also keep girls safe. So I don't know if that answered the question exactly, but that's.
Thank you, Marika. That was terrific. So we will end promptly at the top of the hour, and so we have approximately 90 seconds left. And I'm going to take that to remind you all that this webinar has been recorded. It will be available on the bernardvanleer.org website. It will also be posted to YouTube. Every attendee that registered for this will also be sent a link that allows you to access it. And then a couple of other notes that this current issue of Early Childhood Matters is available both on earlychildhoodmatters.org as well as on the Bernard Van Leer website currently. And so we encourage you to check that out. I want to especially thank our panelists, Gary Evans, Leah Karsten, and Marika Shiori-Clark. They were fantastic. They gave generously of their time both for the journal and for this webinar. And I also especially want to thank the Bernard Van Leer team that I've had the pleasure of working with, including Teresa Marino, as well as Andrew Wright and others. And so thank you all so much for being a part of this. Thank you for the work that you do in the world, and we'll look forward to connecting with you all again soon. Thank you.